Last month, the Penguins organization unfortunately learned the unfortunate news of former GM Ray Shero's passing. Ray Shero was the Penguins general manager from 2006 to 2014, where he essentially took the team from a young, blossoming team with the emergence of Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin to a Stanley Cup champion and a contending team that eventually won back-to-back Stanley Cups after his tenure. Shero was blessed coming into this organization with Crosby, Malkin, and Fleury, and even Stahl and Letang already all being there, but he did a tremendous job maintaining that success and adding to it with key depth players that got the Penguins to their winning and championship pedigree. So today, to honor the late Ray Shero, we're going to go over his career, specifically with the Penguins. I know he had a fantastic long career just in hockey in general. He was the son of Fred Shero, for God's sakes. But this is a Penguins channel, and I want to just go over the 8 years he was the general manager of the Pittsburgh Penguins. And we're going to do it in chronological order. In 2006, he took over for Craig Patrick, who left the Penguins, but he came back. He's still involved in the organization. But as general manager, Craig Patrick stepped down, left, whatever you want to call it, and Ray Shero was hired. Now, like I said before, he came in with Fleury, Crosby, Malkin, Letang already there, so he had a great young core, but it was about building that and taking that team from a good young team to a Stanley Cup contender. His first major event was, of course, the 2006 NHL draft. He did draft Jordan Staal, which became a crucial player in the Penguins organization, so re-signed Marc-Andre Fleury to a 2-year deal. This was 2006, and Fleury this was his first major contract outside of his entry-level deal. That was a 2-year, $2.6 million contract, $1.3 million a season for Fleury. He also acquires Gary Roberts at the trade deadline. Now, I know Gary Roberts wasn't a Stanley Cup winner with the Penguins, but he's a very notable player just in NHL history. He had a great career, so I thought that was worth including. However, at the end of his first season, the Penguins lose in the first round to the Ottawa Senators. That is the first year of the Stanley Cup playoffs for the Crosby tenure. That offseason, he signed notable free agents Peter Sikora and Daryl Sador. He also re-signed young defenseman Ryan Whitney. He also re-signed head coach Marcel Therrien to a 1-year deal. And then, of course, he signed Sidney Crosby to his first major contract outside of his entry-level deal. That was a 5-year, $43.5 million deal, which, of course, is $8.7 million. And that, of course, is notable. I know that in retrospect, it's expected, Crosby obviously will stay. But, you look at some of these other players that may have hiccups in re-signing long-term deals and staying with the franchise that drafted them. Shero got it done, and we'll see later he got it done with Malkin and Fleury again and Letang as well. So to re-sign Crosby, I know that's something you obviously expect him to do. That's one of your top priorities as general manager, but he should be commended for that. He kept Crosby in Pittsburgh, and that's a pretty damn good thing. So moving into 07-08, in probably his biggest deal as a general manager thus far, he acquires Marian Hossa and Pascal Dupuis at the trade deadline from the Atlanta Thrashers. Hossa, of course, we know the story there. It didn't work out with him in Pittsburgh because he was a little crybaby and went to leave. And then Dupuis, just the throw-in guy that was added towards the deal, becomes one of the best Penguins wingers in the 2010s and a great line mate for Sidney Crosby. He also acquired Hal Gill, which is a very important piece to that 09 team. And a real quick sidebar, there are 2 very interesting players that were involved in that trade. What was traded was draft picks, but the 2 players that they became or were Andy Bathgate, Jr. And those of you who know Penguins history and just NHL history might recognize that name. It's not the one from the 1960s and 70s. It is Andy Bathgate, former Penguins grandson. So that's very interesting. And the other player draft pick that was involved in that was Jimmy Hayes, Kevin Hayes' younger brother, who unfortunately passed. And then in the offseason, like I mentioned, like he did with Crosby, he re-signed. Fleury's deal from before was up. He re-signed Marc-Andre Fleury, and Malkin was up that year out of his entry-level deal. So he kept both of those players. Malkin's deal was a 5-year, $43.5 million contract. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, it's the same exact contract. Crosby signed $8.7 million a year. For Fleury, this was his second major contract out of his entry-level deal. This was a 7-year, $35 million contract for $5 million a year. And that was a good bit of money back then in 2007. So he's got Crosby and Malkin and Fleury locked in for a good bit. And that's a great core right there. But of course, in 07-08, the result of that season, the Penguins losing the Stanley Cup final with the Red Wings. Moving on to 08-09, of course, The Penguins were not doing too hot around the Christmas break, so Shero decides to ditch Michel Therrien and promote Wilkes-Barre head coach Dan Bilesma. At the trade deadline, Shero made two fantastic moves that greatly boosted the Penguins' Stanley Cup lineup by adding Bill Guerin and Chris Kunitz at the trade deadline. In my opinion, Ray Shero's magnum opus was the Chris Kunitz trade because he went on to be a fantastic player for the Penguins. And then, of course, the Pittsburgh Penguins win the 2009 Stanley Cup. The Penguins follow that season up by losing to the Canadiens in 7 games in 2010 in the second round, but that offseason, Shero got to work. Letang was up then, and he got that done. And then at the draft, Shero drafts Bo Bennett, Brian Rust, who is still on the Penguins to this day, and Tom Kuhnhackl, who was a notable player in the back-to-back runs. Also that year, I didn't put players on the board who left and stuff, but it is worth noting that Sergei Gonchar was up that year and the Penguins decided to let him walk. So to replace him, Shero had a couple of ideas. One of his ideas was to go and get the rights to Dan Hamhuis. The Penguins trade a third-round pick for his rights to sign, but he doesn't sign. And the Penguins go elsewhere, signing 2 notable free agent defensemen, Zbigniew Michalek and Paul Martin. I will always speak highly of Paul Martin. He was a fantastic shutdown defenseman for the Penguins in the 2010s and even made the Olympic team. It's unfortunate that he never won a Stanley Cup with the Penguins or in general. He lost, I believe, the 16 final with the Sharks to the Penguins, but he was kind of the Brian Dumoulin before Brian Dumoulin came along. In 2011, the Penguins also made a very notable deal around the deadline, acquiring Matt Niskanen and James Neal for Alex Golgoski. James Neal, of course, being kind of the throw-in player for that, and he turns out to be pretty damn good. And Matt Niskanen was not too bad himself. Also at that year's deadline, Shero decided to bring back Alexei Kovalev, who was very old at that time, but it was kind of he was a veteran maybe, and it didn't work out. The Penguins lost to the Lightning in 7 games in the first round that year. And then in 2012, they lost to the Flyers in the first round. And moving on to that offseason, it's perhaps his most notable offseason as a Penguins general manager. Decisions had to be made this year, most notably with Jordan Staal, who, yes, Shero was able to re-sign Crosby, Malkin, Letang, and Fleury, but Jordan Staal was one that he was unable to. He offered him the same contract that he ended up signing in Carolina, but it was all about where Staal would play in the lineup. Being a third-line center wasn't necessarily in his best interest. He wanted to be further up in the lineup, not behind Malkin and Crosby, so the Penguins trade him at the 2012 NHL Draft, which was also in Pittsburgh. That was a huge day for the Penguins organization and, of course, for Ray Shero. The Penguins traded Jordan Staal to the Carolina Hurricanes. In return, they got Brandon Sutter, Brian Dumoulin, and the 8th overall pick, which was used to draft Derek Pouliot. Sutter didn't really work out, but Dumoulin, very important piece to the Penguins' back-to-back cups eventually. He also drafted pretty damn well at the draft itself. I know Pouliot didn't work out, but the Penguins also got Olli Maatta in the first round, Teddy Bluger in the second round, and Matt Murray in the third round. So that was a pretty good draft for Shero and his team. And this is really when Shero just started to take bigger risks, and I commend him for doing that because while the Stanley Cup window was definitely open, it was much more challenging to get a winning team together given the increase in numbers and contracts and the less amount of money you had under the salary cap. So it was all about trying to juggle and find pieces again to support the core. And then in 2012-2013, the lockout-shortened season, Shero also has a really eventful year. He acquires Thomas Vokoun after the shit show Fleury had in the playoffs against the Flyers. Then came the 2013 trade deadline where Shero just went off. The Penguins had a phenomenal regular season, albeit it was a shortened season, but this team looked like it really could win the Stanley Cup. So Shero goes out and buys hard. He acquires Brendan Morrow, Jerome Iginla, Douglas Murray, and Jussi Jokinen. All of those players were on expiring contracts except for Jokinen. So these were pure rental players except for Jokinen to get the Penguins past that finish line and get them another Stanley Cup under the Crosby era. That unfortunately did not happen as they were swept in the Eastern Conference Final by the Boston Bruins. But acquiring Iginla at that deadline sent shockwaves across the National Hockey League, showing them that, hey, Penguins are serious about getting another cup. And for his efforts that year, Ray Shero won the General Manager of the Year award in 2013. Now, while it didn't work out that season, the Penguins got 2 pretty important players that offseason in the draft that summer with Jake Guentzel and Tristan Jarry. Who would have thought that Jerome McGinley would be kind of overshadowed by what Jake Guentzel would end up doing for the Penguins. Now, the window wasn't closed with the Penguins. Obviously, we know in retrospect it definitely wasn't closed with 16 and 17. But the Penguins were really struggling after that loss in the Eastern Conference Finals to the Bruins to really get back there. They had some troubles with injuries, and just the team depth wasn't there. In 2014, they lose to the New York Rangers in the second round. That was after they acquired far less impressive in terms of names trade deadline crop with Lee Stepniak and Marcel Gottsch that year. And unfortunately, with the core that the Penguins had and the potential that they had, losing in the second round was not enough, and the results weren't there. So that offseason, Ray Shero was fired from the Pittsburgh Penguins. Jason Botterill was named interim general manager, and then, of course, Jim Rutherford took over later that summer. In 2015, Shero found another job as general manager of the New Jersey Devils, replacing Lou Lamoriello. In retrospect, I know the Penguins could have won more Stanley Cups in this era, but Ray Shero also doesn't play for the Penguins. He's just the general manager. In my opinion, he did just about as good of a job he could have done to give this team a chance to win Stanley Cups. Unfortunately, they only got one, and just the players overall that Shero was able to acquire. Notably, I have down here Brian Rust and Jake Guentzel, James Neal, Bill Guerin, Chris Kunitz and Pascal Dupuis, Brian Dumoulin, Matt Murray, and Peter Sikora. All notable players. Some of those players obviously went on to play crucial roles in the 16 and 17 Stanley Cup champions, and I think Ray Shero should be commended for being one of the best general managers in Penguins history. Through it all, Ray Shero was the general manager for 622 regular season games. For the Penguins, the team went 373, 193, and 56. They made the playoffs in all 8 years of his tenure, and they were 11-7 in playoff series, and then they got the Stanley Cup in 2009. Thank you, Ray Shero, for what you did for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and may you rest in peace.